The Jetsons, Charlton, issue 12. Jane says a big storm's approaching, and George says they'd better land and that the nearest planet is an uninhabited one, meaning that he's flying the car in space, so there's no excuse for there to be a big storm approaching them to make them do this. The audience is left to assume that witches create thunderclouds in space to spite mortals, and it's so common that they don't question it. But the fact that it isn't explained here is sloppy writing. Ellery has no excuse to think the planet sounds spooky either, speaking of that. George says his car won't start, and his family's hungry. Jane says there's nothing growing, but then she finds a picnic already laid out for her that's full of human food. And George assumes his family found that food instead. It has to be that there's people living here who were luckily generous enough to help them, complete with a car motor working the next time Elroy tries it. They drive home, and thankfully it does turn out that there's people living here who did help them. Too bad the story was only 2 pages. I wanted to learn a lot more about how different this planet was from Earth. The first panel creates a mystery that's more interesting than the story itself. Then I see a page with Jane not being able to balance her checkbook. She tells George they have to save money as she's holding his new suit. Predictably, she plans to send it back. And she also wants to force her husband to give up every single bit of recreation in his life outside the house. Why would lodge meetings be expensive? Poker should be cut for sure, but come on, why is all the cutting in his corner? She's a selfish wife in this story. He clearly doesn't trust her not to leave him if he won't stand up to her and make her do half of the money saving. Someone tells Spacely that a chemical works. A secret formula that he thinks will make them number one. He doesn't know what to do with it overnight, and he tells George to hide it without telling him where, conveniently trusting him not to forget where he put it when he's an idiot. And if George was even a little smart, he'd at least anticipate that he could forget and write down its location. He thinks the obvious hiding spots are too obvious, as I wonder how Spacely is so paranoid. George calls his wife and says he's gotta stay here all night to guard the secret formula. Predictably, he forgot where it was the next day, and they search until Spacely cries. Despite running a successful company, Spacely thinks everyone in it is gonna lose their job if the formula isn't found. Either the company was already doing poorly, or he went into a lot of debt because of the formula and needs to make up for that money. George finds out the formula was in his hat, and somehow the story ends with them telling Jane that he got a raise, even though he still forgot where he put it and put him through all of that trouble because he couldn't even handle one simple task right. It's a pleasant surprise, but it's very baffling because he didn't deserve it. Spacely would have found it eventually if he thought to look under his hat. He just did what he was told. Then Rosie tells George on his day off that she can't serve him breakfast because thanks to Jane, who at least takes responsibility for it to get him to leave Rosie alone, the automatic food dispenser broke down and she forgot to call a repairman. So he's told to settle for instant breakfast pills because for no reason they don't keep leftovers or non-cooked stuff in a fridge and cupboard. You'd think the food would be kept in the food dispenser if nothing else. So I assume they can't even so much as open the thing to get at the food. And George doesn't want a bigger bill from the repairman by damaging it to get access to the food. George walks into a tree outside because he can't see 2 inches in front of him with all of that funk. Since when is the Jetsons needlessly dark in tone like this to the point of having this happen? It's supposed to be an ideal future. The story ends with Astro having something on his tail to light the way ahead. I guess these advanced people didn't have flashlights, but somehow didn't stop having them because they ditched them for something else, like cell phones. I don't know why George was kidding himself thinking he could come home to a quiet evening when he knows he has a family with a teenager in it. So of course Judy's having a party. Someone she knows plays the guitar and Rosie's singing, which is even more unlikely. George has got every reason to be surprised and freaked out because Rosie's never that fun-loving. Maybe it's just that's another universe. She even forces him to dance with her, even though he's her boss. Jane was listening to music from headphones so she could read the newspaper. She tells George that Judy brought a band home because their father didn't want them in the house playing that music. George decides to take Jane to a restaurant to get away from all of the noise. They could have just gone somewhere free like the park. Jane looks selfish by saying that now she knows how to get him to take her out. So she's gonna have him get put through this again. And while he can't commend her on being so smart, it's not trustworthy. At least George cares enough to ask Judy if everyone had a good time at the party the next day. She says yes, but wishes he wasn't a square in front of her friends. He reads a book to get an idea and walks ahead holding some boxes, wanting to show Jane something. Jane laughs at him for wearing a ridiculous wig and outfit. Judy and her friend are actually impressed by it. Well, it is the future. George gets shown a green scooter and asks to give it a try. Then the next panel is needlessly depressing as a cop tells him to follow him as he's wearing a completely different outfit, and I don't even get to learn why. Jane looks melodramatic by telling him this is the most ridiculous thing he's ever done. Just because he drove a flying scooter? Was he that bad at it when he can drive a car just fine? Somehow, she's never been so humiliated when he's always a clumsy idiot. How does someone else's behavior reflect badly on her? He apologizes and promises not to put the outfit on again after the day's over. Why did he put it on? It just cuts him in the outfit for no reason. The story ends with him showing Judy a picture of him in the blue vest that he had taken so that his grandkids wouldn't think of him as a square. Rote calling him crazy makes sense because he should know they'd think that anyways from his behavior most of the time, and one photo wouldn't convince them. In the next story, a person with green skin and pointy ears reminding me of a vampire gives Judy a diamond necklace, and she says that's nice of him. George says an interjection that I'd expect to mean he disapproves, but his smiling keeps going in the next panels because he thankfully appreciates that he gave her the present, instead of having a problem with him for being from Venus, a planet that must have been terraformed by witches. It turns out diamonds are all over his backyard, which somehow I doubt is the case on Venus. So I guess he's rich, naturally wants to partner up with him to become rich off of these. But then when he puts them in the water for absolutely no reason, they dissolve, which he tried to tell him. And the story ends there. I hate that. How are diamonds still rare and expensive enough to get George and Judy's appreciation when they're all over the average Venusian's backyard, and Venusians can live on Earth like it's nothing? They can't be actual diamonds. It's really too bad the story ended there, because I wanted to see a lot more of what would come out of Judy dating an alien and what his personality was like. In the next story, we see Elroy standing in front of a big sign with other kids, advertising a $1,000 first prize for a race to Mars with a powerful rocket racer. One of them wants the money for building one, as if there's any chance that kids could build one. Even if 3D printers that can build anything are in the hands of the common man, they'd still need to know years of stuff about engineering to know how to make functional blueprints for a rocket racer. Somehow, Elroy thinks $1 would let him buy a junior rocket. And George happily agrees. So he wasn't going to try to build one. Jane wonders if it's safe, and George thinks it couldn't lift a magazine off the ground. He doubts the kids are trying to build a toy rocket, and Elroy gives him $1 later. He wonders where he got all that money, and finds out he won the big rocket race to Mars. Which I should have seen, because that'd be nice and interesting to look at and exciting, because the characters in this series aren't guaranteed to win or lose. George wonders how they won with the little toy rocket. Each of them bought a rocket, and put them all together. Of course, I like that he's smiling about it. In the next story, George plans on going on a fishing trip with his friend to a crater on Jupiter because Jupiter must have been terraformed by witches. I honestly don't know why the writers of the Jetsons keep using gas planets as inhabitable planets without explaining it. They must have known better. Jane hopes they'll catch something, and it turns out the crater and lake got bigger. I have to assume the planet got hit with another meteor. He gets threatened by a mosquito bigger than his head. He wouldn't call it a mosquito at that point. And they should have come here armed if they could be threatened by aliens anytime they visit another planet. They get scared by a giant piranha, and the story ends with them leaving, so that's sad. But at least I got to see giant green spotted mushrooms. So that's another interesting thing about fake Jupiter. In the next story, George kisses Jane's cheek and says for 2 cents he'd stay home today because Paisley has been on his back for days. It's not as romantic because he's not saying he wishes he could stay because he loves being with her. Thankfully, all she does is reassure him. She tells him not to pay too much attention to how annoying Paisley is because he has business pressures on his mind. George could have easily not pointed out that he looks frustrated. Of course, he snaps at him for it because he's a jerk, and this just reminded him that he's frustrated. George finds out that rather than being upset from overworking like what's being built up to, his wife has been visiting her mother on the terraformed Mars for weeks. And I'm expected to believe he appreciates her absence even though he's not eating well because of it. So George gets the idea to have Rosie make a wonderful meal to give Paisley a dinner tonight. Paisley can't wait and says he's really hungry. I thought he was choosing not to eat because he missed his wife. But this makes more sense because he really has no reason to. Instead, he wasn't eating well because he didn't know how to use the Food-O-Matic as well as her. Thankfully, he does say that was the best meal he had in years. But it confuses me even more because he wishes Mrs. Paisley could cook well. Even though in the show, he said he married her because she can cook. So why hasn't he been eating well? So you'd think he'd refuse the dinner because he doesn't feel like eating. Jane gives Rosie the credit, and Paisley says the universe should know her recipes. He plans to have her as a guest chef on a space gourmet series, and decides to call the network even though she's just a maid bot for an average family. So what are the chances that she'd do well when compared to a bunch of professional chefs? I guess he very recently found out about this series, and that's why he didn't do this after he first met Rosie, and she pelted him with pineapple cake that he really likes the taste of. The text says she's been invited and prepared her most mouth-watering recipe, and she's shown making it with a bunch of extra robot hands that come out of the table to hold cups for her and pour seasoning into a bowl and stir it for her. Then she decides to set the temperature at something, and she keeps saying the word "at," as if she doesn't remember what to set it at. Why didn't she choose a recipe she's got experience with? She just chose a recipe she never tried before when that's clearly an unacceptable gamble to take. How would she forget which temperature to set something at when she's a robot? She ends the story looking sad, saying that she didn't mind burning the dinner, but they showed it again on instant replay and it was just as bad. The first story is about George's family somehow having to land on the nearest planet because of a big storm, and after looking for food for nothing, they end up getting food and being able to drive home because the aliens helped them. It's too bad I never learned anything about this place. The second story is about George having to hide something and forgetting where he put it because he somehow didn't write it down on a secret note of his. But he would have forgotten where that was too. But eventually, after searching for it with his boss, he finds it, and somehow gets rewarded. Which is only nice to see because he got something out of all of that searching because the boss won't reward him for revealing he did his job right like he was supposed to. It didn't take advantage of the sci-fi setting because it could have had to hide anything for all it mattered. The third story involves George suddenly having to deal with a very thick fog outside, and thinking to make Astro's tail glow to deal with it, which seems cool, but why didn't he use a flashlight instead? I couldn't be more apathetic to the next story, because it's completely mundane. George eventually wants to look like he fits in with Judy's crowd, and somehow he ends up being told to follow a cop just because he was trying out riding a flying scooter. And Jane insists that she got humiliated by him riding it for no reason. Since when does he not want to look lame in the eyes of Judy's friends? The fifth story has Judy get a diamond necklace from her alien boyfriend, only for George to put it in water for no reason where it melts away. Disappointing George, who thought he could get rich from him. And I have to assume that the so-called diamonds aren't valuable at all, because otherwise, he'd definitely get rich. He'd just have to not put them in the water that time. The sixth story has Elroy wants to win money from a contest with a powerful rocket racer. and eventually wins from a clever idea. But for no reason, the contest was kept off-screen instead of an exciting competition being shown. The story could have gotten rid of some of the panels and had enough space to show it. The 7th story is an overly predictable one where George and his friend go fishing on another planet, so go figure they get freaked out by the wildlife and go home. Because for some reason they didn't bring a gun. But it's too uncreative because the wildlife are just inexplicably oversized earth animals. The 8th story has basically encouraged Rosie to be a chef on a TV show because of her cooking, only for her to screw it up for absolutely no reason. This didn't take advantage of its sci-fi environment.